Breaking news that's sending shockwaves through British politics right now. Nigel Farage has just dropped a bombshell that could shake the very foundations of local government across the UK. What he's uncovered is so disturbing, so fundamentally corrupt, that it's left even seasoned political observers absolutely speechless. Like, we're talking about millions of pounds, secret deals, and a web of corruption that reaches into the heart of British councils. And here's the most chilling part. Keir Starmer, the man who promised to clean up British politics, has gone completely silent. Not a single word, not one statement. The question everyone's asking is simple. What is he trying to hide? Because what Farage has exposed isn't just a minor scandal. It's a systematic betrayal of the British people that's been happening right under our noses. Stick with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about how this country is really being run. The story begins just 1 minute ago when Nigel Farage stood up in front of cameras and revealed something that the establishment has been desperately trying to keep buried. He's uncovered evidence of massive financial irregularities in multiple councils across England. And we're not talking about small amounts here. We're talking about tens of millions of pounds that have simply vanished into thin air. Money that was supposed to fix your roads, fund your local services, keep your community safe, gone. But here's where it gets really interesting. Farage didn't just stumble upon this by accident. He's been quietly investigating for months, gathering documents, speaking to whistleblowers, building an airtight case. And what he's found is absolutely staggering. Council officials awarding contracts to companies owned by their relatives. Procurement processes that were rigged from the start. Financial records that have been doctored to hide the truth. This isn't incompetence, this is deliberate, calculated corruption on a scale that should terrify every single taxpayer in this country. Let's talk specifics, because the details of this scandal are absolutely jaw-dropping. Farage has identified at least 7 councils where the same pattern keeps repeating itself. Multi-million pound contracts being awarded without proper tender processes. Companies with no track record suddenly winning huge deals. And when you dig deeper into who owns these companies, you find the same names popping up again and again. Council members, their family members, their close associates. It's a closed loop of corruption where public money is being funneled directly into private pockets. One council in the Midlands awarded a £15 million housing contract to a company that was only registered 6 months earlier. The director of that company, the brother-in-law of the council's procurement officer. Another council in the north gave a £12 million waste management contract to a firm that had never handled anything larger than a £100,000 job. The connection. The company's majority shareholder was the former deputy leader of that very council. But it gets worse, so much worse. Farage has documentation showing that when whistleblowers inside these councils tried to raise concerns, they were sentenced. Some were moved to different departments, others faced disciplinary action for completely unrelated issues that conveniently appeared right after they started asking questions. A few were forced out entirely, their careers destroyed for having the audacity to speak up. This is the kind of intimidation and cover-up you'd expect in a corrupt dictatorship, not in modern Britain. One whistleblower, a senior finance officer with over 20 years of experience, tried to flag irregularities in contract awards. Within weeks, she found herself under investigation for alleged misconduct that no one could actually specify. She was suspended, her reputation was trashed, and eventually she was forced to resign with a non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from speaking publicly about what she'd seen. That's not how innocent organisations behave. That's how guilty ones try to protect themselves. The financial impact of this corruption is absolutely devastating. We're talking about money that could have rebuilt crumbling schools, fixed potholed roads, funded youth services, supported elderly care. Instead, it's been siphoned off to line the pockets of corrupt officials and their cronies. Farage estimates that across these 7 councils alone, over £100 million has been misappropriated in the last 3 years. £100 million of your money taken from services you depend on, stolen through a system that was supposed to protect the public in interest. And this is just what he's uncovered so far. How many more councils are involved? How deep does this corruption really go? These are questions that demand immediate answers, but instead we're getting silence from the very people who should be leading the charge for accountability. Now, here's what makes this even more explosive. Farage has evidence that concerns about some of these councils were raised with the government over a year ago. Reports were filed, questions were asked, and nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. The concerns were acknowledged, filed away, and forgotten. Which raises the obvious question, why? Why would a government that claims to care about transparency and accountability ignore clear evidence of massive corruption? What possible reason could there be for allowing this to continue? Unless, of course, the corruption goes higher than anyone wants to admit. Unless there are connections and relationships that would be exposed if someone actually started pulling on these threads. That's the terrifying implication of Starmer's silence right now. Because his refusal to address this isn't just bad politics, it's starting to look like complicity. The timeline of this scandal reveals something even more disturbing than the corruption itself. Farage has laid out a detailed chronology that shows this wasn't a series of isolated incidents or unfortunate mistakes. This was systematic, coordinated, and it happened with a level of organisation that suggests people knew exactly what they were doing. It started small, with relatively minor contracts being awarded to favoured companies. 100,000 here, 200,000 there. Amounts that wouldn't immediately raise red flags or trigger extensive oversight. But over time, as these corrupt officials realised they could get away with it, the numbers grew. The contracts became bigger, the companies more brazen, and the cover-ups more sophisticated. What we're seeing now is the end result of years of unchecked corruption that was allowed to metastasize because nobody in a position of authority had the courage or the will to stop it. The paper trail that Farage has assembled shows planning meetings, email exchanges and financial transfers that demonstrate this was never about incompetence or administrative errors. This was theft. Pure and simple, carried out by people who believed they were untouchable. The methods these corrupt officials used are straight out of a criminal playbook. They created shell companies with deliberately vague names that made it difficult to trace ownership. They established complex corporate structures with multiple layers of subsidiaries to obscure the flow of money. They manipulated procurement scoring systems to ensure their preferred bidders would always come out on top, even when their bids were more expensive or less qualified than competitors. In some cases, they even went so far as to create fake competitions, submitting deliberately poor bids from legitimate companies to make their chosen contractor look better by comparison. The sophistication of these schemes is actually remarkable in its audacity. These weren't amateurs making opportunistic grabs for cash. These were experienced officials who understood the system intimately and knew exactly how to exploit its weaknesses. They knew which regulations had loopholes, which oversight mechanisms were understaffed, and which watchdogs weren't actually watching. And they used that knowledge to steal from the public with industrial efficiency. What makes this particularly infuriating is that the warning signs were everywhere. Independent auditors raised concerns, local journalists published investigative reports, opposition councillors asked pointed questions in public meetings. The information was out there for anyone who cared to look. But the system failed at every single level. External auditors who flagged irregularities found their contracts weren't renewed the following year. Journalists who dug too deep suddenly lost access to council press briefings and official sources. Opposition councillors who pushed for investigations were accused of playing politics and trying to score cheap points. The system didn't just fail to catch the corruption, it actively protected it. Every safeguard that was supposed to protect taxpayer money was either bypassed, ignored, or deliberately undermined. And the people responsible for maintaining those safeguards either looked the other way or were complicit in dismantling them. This is what institutional corruption looks like when it reaches its advanced stages. It's not just about individual bad actors anymore, it's about entire systems that have been captured and corrupted from within. The human cost of this scandal cannot be overstated. While corrupt officials were awarding sweetheart contracts to their associates, real people were suffering from the loss of essential services. Libraries closed because there wasn't enough money in the budget. Youth centres shut down. Support programs for vulnerable families were cut. Elderly residents lost access to daycare services. Roads deteriorated to the point of being dangerous. And all the while, the officials responsible for these cuts were telling residents that there simply wasn't enough money, that tough choices had to be made, that austerity demanded sacrifice. But it was all a lie. The money was there. It just wasn't going where it was supposed to go. It was being diverted into private pockets while ordinary people were told to tighten their belts and accept reduced services. Families who depended on council support found themselves abandoned. Small businesses that should have won contracts fairly were shut out by a rigged system. Communities that paid their taxes faithfully and expected basic services in return were betrayed by the very people elected to serve them. This is the real face of corruption, not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but actual lives damaged by greed and dishonesty. Farage has also exposed how this corruption created a culture of fear within these councils. Honest employees who wanted to do the right thing found themselves isolated and targeted. The corrupt officials had created an environment where speaking up meant risking your career, your reputation, and your livelihood. They built networks of loyalists who would protect each other and punish anyone who threatened their schemes. Internal complaint processes were a joke, investigations were superficial at best, and anyone who persisted in raising concerns found themselves labelled as troublemakers or conspiracy theorists. This is how corruption becomes entrenched. It's not enough to steal. You also have to create a system that makes it impossible for honest people to stop you. And that's exactly what happened here. The councils became little fiefdoms where a select group of insiders operated with impunity while everyone else either kept quiet or paid the price for their integrity. Some employees who tried to blow the whistle have described feeling completely powerless watching corruption happen right in front of them and knowing that reporting it would destroy their careers without actually stopping the wrongdoing. That's not just a failure of ethics, it's a failure of every system that's supposed to protect whistleblowers and ensure accountability in public institutions.